The eviction notice trembled in Sarah Mitchell's hands as she stood in the doorway of what had once been her sanctuary. The paper, stamped with official seals and threatening language, gave her exactly 14 days to vacate the small apartment that had sheltered her and her 6-year-old daughter Emma for the past 3 years. The morning sun streaming through the thin curtain seemed to mock her desperation, illuminating the stark reality of their situation with unforgiving clarity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's fingers traced the edges of the notice, her mind struggling to process the finality of the words. 14 days. 2 weeks to find a miracle or watch her world collapse completely. The rent was 3 months overdue, and despite her pleading, phone calls to the property manager, Mrs. Henderson had made it clear that patience had run out. The corporate owners wanted their money, and sentiment had no place in business. Behind her, Emma sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, her blonde curls catching the light as she colored in a book with broken crayons. The child's innocent humming filled the silence, a stark contrast to the storm raging in Sarah's chest. Emma had no idea that their entire life was about to crumble. How could a 6-year-old understand that mommy had failed so completely that they might soon be sleeping in their car? The apartment itself told the story of their gradual decline. Where family photos had once lined the walls, only faded rectangles remained on the paint. The television had been sold 2 months ago, followed by Sarah's grandmother's china set, her wedding ring, and piece by piece, everything of value that had once made this place feel like home. The furniture that remained was sparse and mismatched, picked up from thrift stores and yard sales during better times that now felt like distant memories. Sarah closed the door quietly and leaned against it, closing her eyes to fight back the tears that threatened to spill. She had cried enough over the past year. Tears wouldn't pay the rent or put food on the table. What she needed now was a plan, but every option seemed to lead to the same dead end. The job at Morrison's Diner barely covered their basic needs, even with the extra shifts she'd been picking up. As a waitress, she earned minimum wage plus tips, but tips were unpredictable, and the diner's clientele wasn't exactly known for their generosity. Most customers were truck drivers passing through town, construction workers grabbing quick lunches, or local retirees nursing coffee for hours while sharing gossip. None of them seemed to understand that her smile was painted on, that behind her cheerful demeanor was a woman drowning in bills and responsibilities. The math was cruel and unforgiving. After rent, utilities, groceries, and Emma's daycare, there was nothing left. Sarah had already cut every possible expense. They ate pasta and rice most nights, supplemented by whatever day-old bread the diner let her take home. Emma's clothes came from donation bins, and Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd bought something new for herself. Yet somehow, the money always ran out before the month did. She thought about her late husband David, and the familiar ache settled in her chest. He had been the steady one, the planner, the one who somehow always made everything work. When the cancer took him 18 months ago, it didn't just rob Emma of her father and Sarah of her husband. It took their financial stability, their future plans, and their safety net. David's medical bills had consumed their savings, and his life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses. The sound of Emma's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Mommy, are you okay? You look sad." Sarah quickly composed herself and turned around, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about what we should have for lunch." Emma's face lit up with the easy joy that only children possessed. "Can we have pancakes? With the syrup that looks like a smiley face?" The request was so simple, so innocent, and yet it hit Sarah like a physical blow. They had exactly $17 in the apartment, and she needed to make it last until her next paycheck in 4 days. Pancakes felt like an impossible luxury, But the hope in Emma's eyes made refusing feel like another small betrayal. "We'll see, baby. Why don't you keep coloring while Mommy makes some phone calls?" Sarah retreated to the tiny kitchen and pulled out her phone. Staring at the contact list that had grown shorter over the months, pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had already borrowed money from her sister Karen 3 times, and the last conversation had been strained and uncomfortable. Karen had her own family to worry about, and Sarah could hear the judgment in her voice, the unspoken suggestion that maybe it was time to consider other options. Her thumb hovered over her mother's number, but she couldn't bring herself to dial. The last conversation with her parents had ended in an argument about Sarah's poor choices and lack of planning. They had offered to take Emma for a while, just until Sarah got back on her feet, but the suggestion had felt like admitting total failure as a mother. She would find another way. She had to. The refrigerator hummed loudly in the silence, and Sarah opened it to survey their meager supplies. Half a gallon of milk that would expire tomorrow, 3 eggs, a partial loaf of bread, and some leftover rice from 2 nights ago. In the freezer, a small bag of frozen vegetables completed their inventory. She could stretch it to last maybe 2 more days if she was creative. But then what? Her phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart sank when she saw it from the daycare center. Emma's account was past due, and they needed payment by Friday, or they would have to discuss alternative arrangements. Sarah closed her eyes and did the math again, knowing it wouldn't change the outcome. Between her current debt and Friday's deadline, she needed to come up with nearly $800. The hopelessness of the situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had been fighting this battle for months, always managing to find just enough to keep going one more week, one more day. But the eviction notice felt different, final, like the universe had decided. She had struggled long enough, and it was time to accept defeat. A knock at the door made her jump, and her first thought was that Mrs. Henderson had come to discuss the eviction. But when she opened the door, she found Mrs. Garcia from next door, holding a covered plate and wearing a concerned expression. "I brought you some empanadas," the elderly woman said in her accented English. "I made too many for just Carlos and me." Sarah's eyes burned with unexpected tears at the kindness. Mrs. Garcia had been bringing them food sporadically for months, always with the same excuse about making too much. Sarah suspected the truth was far different, but she was too grateful to question the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Garcia. That's very kind of you." The older woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I saw the man with the papers this morning. If you need help, if there's anything Carlos and I can do... Sarah shook her head quickly, not trusting herself to speak. The Garcia family had their own financial struggles. Carlos worked construction when his arthritis allowed it, and they lived on a fixed income that barely covered their own needs. Their offer of help only made Sarah feel worse about her situation. "We're managing," she said, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "But thank you, really." Mrs. Garcia studied her for a moment with eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize desperation when they saw it. She nodded slowly and patted Sarah's arm. "Sometimes help comes from unexpected places, Mia. Keep your heart open." After Mrs. Garcia left, Sarah sat at their small kitchen table with the plate of empanadas and the eviction notice spread before her. Emma had wandered over and was eyeing the food with obvious hunger, and Sarah realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch at the diner. "Can I have one, Mommy?" "Of course, sweetheart. Mrs. Garcia made them just for you." As Emma bit into the empanada with obvious delight, Sarah tried to think of any option she hadn't already explored. She had applied for government assistance, but the waiting list was months long. She had looked into second jobs, but Emma's daycare schedule made that nearly impossible. She had considered moving back in with her parents, but the thought of admitting such complete failure made her stomach turn. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, and Sarah knew she had to make some difficult decisions. The car payment was due next week, and without the car, she couldn't get to work. But if she paid the car payment, there wouldn't be money for groceries. Every choice led to another impossible choice. Like a maze with no exit. Emma finished her empanada and climbed onto Sarah's lap, her small arms wrapping around her mother's neck. "I love you, Mommy." The simple declaration broke something inside Sarah, and she held her daughter tightly, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and trying to memorize the feeling of this moment. Whatever happened next, whatever choices she had to make, Emma would always be her priority. She would find a way to protect her daughter, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. The eviction notice stared back at her from the table. Its official language, a countdown to disaster. 14 days to find a miracle, to discover some solution that had eluded her for months of desperate searching. 14 days to keep from losing the only home had ever known. As the sun began to set outside their small window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah made a silent promise to her daughter and to herself. She would fight until the very last moment. She would explore every option, swallow every bit of pride, and do whatever it took to keep them together. But deep in her heart, past the determination and the desperate hope, a small voice whispered what she was afraid to acknowledge. Sometimes, fighting wasn't enough. Sometimes, despite every effort and sacrifice, the world had already decided your fate. And sometimes, the only choice left was how gracefully you could fall. The phone rang, jarring her from her dark thoughts. The caller ID showed Morrison's Diner, and Sarah's heart jumped with hope. Maybe they needed her to pick up an extra shift. Maybe this was the break she needed. "Sarah? It's Tom. Listen, I hate to do this, but we're going to have to cut your hours starting next week. Business has been slow, and I've got to reduce staff. I'm really sorry." The words hit her like a physical blow, and Sarah gripped the phone tighter. "Tom, please. I need those hours. Isn't there anything else I can do? I'll work for less. I'll take the overnight shifts, anything." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I wish there was something, Sarah. You're a good worker, and if things pick up, you'll be the first person I call. But right now, I just can't afford to keep everyone at full hours." After Tom hung up, Sarah stared at the phone in her hand, the final piece of her crumbling world falling into place. Reduced hours meant even less money, which meant the impossible. Situation had just become truly hopeless. Emma looked up at her with trusting eyes, still unaware that their world was ending. "What's for dinner, Mommy?" Sarah looked at the empanadas Mrs. Garcia had brought, at the nearly empty refrigerator, at the eviction notice that would change everything in just 2 weeks. She thought about the job that was disappearing, the bills that kept coming, and the future that seemed to hold nothing but darkness. And for the first time since David's death, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to wonder if she was strong enough to keep fighting a battle she couldn't win. The next morning brought no reprieve from Sarah's nightmare. She woke before dawn, her mind immediately flooded with the crushing weight of their situation. 13 days until eviction. Reduced work. Hours, daycare payment due in 3 days. The numbers swirled in her head like a tornado of impossibility, each calculation leading to the same devastating conclusion. Emma was still sleeping peacefully in the small bed they shared, her tiny hand clutched around her favorite stuffed elephant. Sarah watched her daughter's chest rise and fall with the easy rhythm of childhood innocence, and the sight made her chest ache with fierce protectiveness. This beautiful little girl deserved so much more than a mother who couldn't even keep a roof over their heads. Sarah slipped out of bed quietly and padded to the kitchen, where she stood staring at the nearly empty refrigerator. 2 eggs left. A slice of bread. The empanadas from Mrs. Garcia were gone, devoured by Emma's growing appetite. She could make scrambled eggs for breakfast, but then what would they eat for dinner? The $23 in her wallet had to last until Thursday, When her reduced paycheck would barely cover groceries for a few days, the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made her freeze. It was too early for normal tenant movement, and her heart hammered as she wondered if Mrs. Henderson was making early morning rounds to serve more eviction notices. But the footsteps passed by their door, and Sarah released a breath she didn't know she was holding. She made coffee with the last of the grounds, savoring the bitter warmth as she tried to think of any solution she hadn't already explored. The classified ads in yesterday's newspaper lay folded on the counter, and she had circled every job listing that didn't require specific skills or experience. Cleaning services, retail positions, factory work. But they all wanted full-time availability. And without reliable childcare, full-time work was impossible. The irony wasn't lost on her. She needed money to afford childcare so she could work more hours to make money. It was a vicious circle that trapped her more effectively than any chains ever could. Her phone buzzed with a text from the electric company. Final notice, service would be disconnected in 5 days without immediate payment of $247. Sarah closed her eyes and leaned against the counter, feeling the walls of her world closing in from every direction. "Mommy?" Emma's sleepy voice called from the bedroom. "I'm hungry." "Coming, sweetheart." Sarah scrambled the last 2 eggs and toasted the final slice of bread, cutting both into smaller portions to make them seem more substantial. She sat across from Emma at their tiny table, nursing her black coffee while watching her daughter eat with the unself-conscious appetite of childhood. "Mrs. Garcia makes really good food," Emma said, swinging her legs under the table. "Can we make empanadas sometime?" "Maybe," Sarah said, though the ingredients for empanadas might as well have been caviar and champagne for all the accessibility they had. "We'll see." After breakfast, Sarah bundled Emma into her jacket for the walk to daycare. They couldn't afford the gas to drive such a short distance, and besides, she needed to save every drop of fuel for getting to work. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Emma chartered happily about the leaves changing colors, oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around their lives. The daycare center was housed in a converted church basement, and while it wasn't fancy, it was clean and safe. Mrs. Rodriguez, the director, greeted them at the door with a smile that seemed strained around the edges. "Good morning, Sarah. Could I speak with you for a moment?" Sarah's stomach clenched, but she nodded and knelt down to Emma's level. "You go play with your friends, sweetheart. Mommy will be right back." Mrs. Rodriguez led her to a small office cluttered with children's artwork and administrative papers. She closed the door and turned to face Sarah with an expression that mixed sympathy with uncomfortable necessity. "Sarah, I hate to bring this up, but your account is quite behind. We've been flexible because we understand your situation, but our overhead costs keep rising, and we can't carry unpaid accounts indefinitely." "I know," Sarah said quickly. "I'm working on it. I should have the payment by Friday, maybe sooner." The lie came easily now. She had become skilled at manufacturing hope where none existed, at projecting confidence in solutions that didn't exist. But Mrs. Rodriguez had heard similar promises from other struggling parents, and her expression remained sympathetic but firm. "Sarah, I need the full outstanding balance by Friday, or we'll have to suspend Emma's enrollment. I'm truly sorry, but we have our own bills to pay." The outstanding balance was $430. Combined with Friday's regular payment, Sarah needed to produce over $600 in 3 days. The impossibility of it made her feel dizzy. "I understand," she managed to say. "Thank you for being patient with us." The walk to Morrison's diner felt like a death march. Every step took her further from Emma and deeper into the quicksand of their failing situation. The morning shift at the diner was usually quiet, mostly coffee and toast for early commuters and retirees. But today even those meager tips felt crucial. Tom Morrison was behind the grill when she arrived, his weathered face creased with the kind of worry that came from running a small business in a struggling economy. He looked up when she entered, and she could see the regret in his eyes before he even spoke. "Sarah, about what I told you yesterday. I've been thinking about it all night, and maybe there's something we can work out." Hope flared in her chest like a struck match. "Anything, Tom, I'll do anything. I can't give you back the full hours, but what if you took on some additional responsibilities? Bookkeeping, inventory management, that sort of thing. It wouldn't be a huge increase, but every little bit helps, right?" Sarah nodded eagerly, though. She had no experience with bookkeeping beyond balancing her own checkbook, which hadn't exactly been a success story lately. "I'm a quick learner. I can figure it out." "Good. We'll start you on that next week. Maybe 10 extra hours, and we can see how it goes." 10 extra hours at minimum wage would add maybe $60 to her weekly pay after taxes. It wasn't nearly enough to solve their problems, but it was something. A small crack of light in the darkness that had engulfed them. The morning shift passed in a blur of coffee refills and breakfast orders. Sarah moved through the familiar routine with mechanical efficiency, her mind constantly calculating and recalculating their financial situation. Even with the extra hours Tom had offered, they were still hundreds of dollars short of what they needed. Around 11 o'clock, a man walked in whom Sarah had never seen before. He was tall and lean, with the kind of quiet presence that made people notice him without him trying to be noticed. His clothes were clean but well-worn, jeans and a flannel shirt that spoke of practical use rather than fashion. What struck Sarah most was his eyes, which held a depth of understanding that seemed unusual for someone who looked to be in his early 30s. He chose a corner booth and ordered coffee and a slice of pie, speaking with a soft drawl that hinted at Southern origins. Sarah served him with her professional smile, but something about his demeanor made her look twice. He seemed to be studying the diner with the attention of someone who noticed details most people missed. "You've been working here for a long?" he asked when she refilled his coffee. "About a year," Sarah replied, then found herself adding, "It's honest work." He nodded slowly, and she had the strange feeling that he understood exactly what she meant by that. Honest work's getting harder to find these days. There was something in his voice, a weariness that matched her own, that made her pause. Most customers made small talk to pass time, but this felt different, more genuine. "Are you just passing through town?" she asked, which was unusual for her. She typically kept conversations with customers brief and professional. "Thinking about staying for a while," he said. "Depends on whether I can find the right situation." An older man at the counter called for more coffee, and Sarah excused herself to attend to him. But she found her eyes drifting back to the stranger in the corner booth. There was something about him that felt familiar, though she was certain they had never met. During her afternoon break, Sarah sat in the diner's small back office with Tom's ledger books spread before her, trying to make sense of the bookkeeping system. The numbers swam before her tired eyes, but she forced herself to focus. This extra work might be her only chance to earn enough money to buy them a little more time. The bell over the front door chimed, and through the office window, she could see the stranger from the corner booth approaching the counter. Tom was taking his order for lunch, and their conversation seemed to extend beyond the usual pleasantries. "You looking for work?" she heard Tom ask. "Depends on what kind of work," the stranger replied. "I could use some help with repairs around here. Nothing fancy, just basic maintenance. Can't pay much, but it's something." Sarah's attention sharpened. If Tom was hiring someone else, even for part-time maintenance work, it meant the diner's finances were better than he had let on when he cut her hours. The unfairness of it stung, but she pushed the feeling aside. She couldn't afford the luxury of resentment. "I can handle basic repairs," the stranger said. "Name's Connor Blake, by the way." Connor Blake. Sarah filed the name away without really knowing why. There was something about this man that intrigued her, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. When she returned to the dining area, Connor was sitting at the counter, eating a sandwich and talking quietly with Tom about the diner's maintenance needs. Sarah busied herself with cleaning tables and restocking supplies, but she found herself listening to their conversation. "The booth in the corner's got a wobbly leg," Tom was saying. "And the coffee machine's been making that grinding noise again." "I can take a look at both," Connor replied. "Mind if I ask how long you've owned this place?" "Going on 15 years now." "It's not much, but it's mine." There was pride in Tom's voice, and Sarah understood it. Even in her desperate situation, she could appreciate the satisfaction that came from building something with your own hands. She wondered what Connor Blake had built in his life, and what had brought him to their small town dot as the afternoon wore on. Sarah noticed Connor helping Tom with small tasks around the diner. He fixed the wobbly booth with a few simple adjustments, and when she brought him another cup of coffee, he looked up at her with those thoughtful eyes. "You seem like you work hard," he said quietly. The comment caught her off guard. "Everyone works hard. Not everyone," he said. "And not everyone does it with grace." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't used to compliments, especially from strangers, and she wasn't sure how to respond. "Thank you," she said simply. "You got family?" Connor asked, and something in his tone made the question feel less like small talk and more like genuine interest. "A daughter," Sarah said, then wondered why she had shared that information. "She's 6. Connor nodded slowly. "That's a good age. Still believes in magic." "She does," Sarah agreed, thinking of Emma's easy joy in simple things like changing leaves. "And Mrs. Garcia's empanadas. I hope she always will." "Kids are resilient," Connor said. "They adapt to whatever normal their parents create for them." There was something in his voice that suggested personal experience, and Sarah found herself wondering about his story. But before she could ask, Tom called her over to help with a large party that had just walked in. The rest of her shift passed quickly, and as closing time approached, Sarah's mind returned to the crushing weight of their situation. Tomorrow would bring them one day closer to eviction, one day closer to losing Emma's daycare spot, one day closer to complete disaster. She was wiping down the last table when Connor approached her. "Mind if I ask you something?" Sarah looked up, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "Sure, you're in some kind of trouble," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah's first instinct was to deny it, to maintain the facade that everything was fine. But something about Connor's direct gaze and gentle tone made her defenses crumble slightly. "What makes you say that?" "I've been in trouble before," he said simply. "I recognize the signs. The way you count change 3 times before putting it in your pocket. How you stretch 1 cup of coffee through an entire break. The careful way you talk about the future, like you're not sure there's going to be one." Sarah felt exposed, as if he had seen through all her carefully constructed pretenses. "It's nothing I can't handle." Connor studied her for a long moment. "What if I told you there might be another way? Another way to what? To solve whatever problem you're facing. Something that might seem crazy at first, but could work if you're desperate enough to try it." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "What are you talking about?" Connor glanced around the empty diner, then leaned closer. "I need something too. Something that looks normal from the outside, but isn't real on the inside. A situation where 2 people help each other solve problems that neither could solve alone." Sarah stared at him, trying to understand what he was suggesting. "I don't understand." "Meet me here tomorrow morning," Connor said. "Before your shift. I'll explain everything then. But think about this. What if the solution to your problem wasn't finding more money, but finding someone who needed what you could offer?" He left money on the table for his meal and tip, then walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back. "Sometimes the most impossible situations require impossible solutions," he said. The question is whether you're desperate enough to consider one." After he left, Sarah stood in the empty diner, Connor's words echoing in her mind. She had no idea what he was proposing, but the fact that he had seen through her carefully maintained facade both terrified and intrigued her. Whatever Connor Blake was suggesting, it sounded dangerous. But as she thought about Emma sleeping in their soon-to-be former apartment, about the eviction notice counting down their remaining days, about the impossible mathematics of their survival, Sarah realized that dangerous might be exactly what they needed. The walk home felt different tonight. Instead of the familiar weight of hopelessness, Sarah carried something new, curiosity about what tomorrow might bring, and the fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't over yet. Sarah arrived at Morrison's diner 30 minutes before her shift, her nerves stretched taut with anticipation and dread. She had barely slept, Connor Blake's cryptic words spinning through her mind like a broken record. Emma had asked why Mommy seemed so fidgety during breakfast, and Sarah had struggled to explain her restlessness without revealing the desperation that clawed at her chest. Connor was already there, sitting in the same corner booth with a cup of coffee steaming before him. The morning light streaming through the diner's windows caught the strong lines of his face, and Sarah noticed details she had missed yesterday. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow, and his hands wrapped around the coffee cup bore the calluses of someone who had worked with them for years. "You came," he said as she slid into the booth across from him. His voice held a note of surprise, as if he hadn't been entirely certain she would show up. "You said you had a solution," Sarah replied, cutting straight to the point. "I need to hear what it is." Connor studied her face for a moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was measuring her resolve, testing whether she was truly ready for whatever he was about to propose. "Before I explain anything," he said slowly, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to suggest isn't illegal, but it isn't exactly honest either. It's a gray area that requires both of us to pretend to be something we're not." Sarah's stomach clenched. "What kind of pretending?" Connor leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I need a wife. Not a real wife, but someone who can play the role convincingly. Someone with a child would actually make it more believable." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "I don't understand. Why would you need a fake wife?" "Because I'm about to inherit something significant, but there are conditions attached. Old-fashioned conditions that require me to be married with. A stable family life before I can claim what's rightfully mine." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Inherit what?" "My grandfather's ranch in Montana. 3,000 acres, livestock, and enough mineral rights to ensure financial security for generations. But my grandfather was a traditional man who believed that wealth should only pass to men who had proven they could build and maintain a family." The pieces began to fall into place in Sarah's mind. "So you need someone to pretend to be your wife until you inherit the ranch." "Exactly. And in return, I would take care of all your immediate financial problems. Rent, bills, daycare, groceries, everything. You and your daughter would have security while we maintain the charade." Sarah felt her head spinning. The offer was so far beyond anything she had imagined that it seemed almost surreal. How long would this arrangement last? 6 months, maybe less. "Once the inheritance is finalized and the property is legally mine, we could go our separate ways. You'd have enough money saved up to start fresh wherever you want, and I'd have what I need to build the life I want." The waitress in Sarah's brain was already calculating the mathematics of the proposal. 6 months of financial security. 6 months without the constant anxiety of unpaid bills and eviction notices. 6 months for Emma to have stability and enough food and a mother who wasn't constantly stressed to the breaking point. "Why me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Connor's expression softened slightly. "Because you're exactly what this situation requires. You're a good mother who's clearly struggling through no fault of your own. You're not looking for a handout, you're looking for a chance to work for what you need. And frankly, you're desperate enough to consider an arrangement that most people would reject without a second thought. The blunt assessment stung, but Sarah couldn't argue with its accuracy. She was desperate. Desperately broke, desperately scared, and desperately out of options. What would this actually involve? She asked. Day to day, I mean. We'd need to relocate to Montana, to the ranch. You and Emma would live there with me, and to the outside world, we'd appear to be a married couple raising a daughter together. My grandfather's lawyer will be checking up on us periodically to ensure the marriage is legitimate, so we'd need to be convincing. Sarah's mind raced with practical concerns. What about Emma's school? Her friends? This is the only home she's ever known. There are good schools in Montana, and kids adapt faster than adults think they will. As for friends, she'd make new ones. And honestly, is what she has here really so good that it's worth preserving? The question hit home harder than Connor probably intended. Emma's current school was overcrowded and underfunded. Their apartment was small and depressing, and they had no money for activities or experiences that might enrich Emma's childhood. What exactly was Sarah trying to preserve by keeping them here? How do I know you're not some kind of predator? Sarah asked bluntly. How do I know this isn't an elaborate scheme to harm my daughter? Connor reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, from which he extracted several documents. This is my driver's license, my social security card, and a letter from the law firm handling my grandfather's estate. You can verify everything I've told you. You can also insist on separate bedrooms and any other boundaries that make you feel safe. Sarah examined the documents carefully. Connor Blake, 32 years old, with an address in Billings, Montana. The law firm letterhead looked legitimate, and the letter outlined the terms of an inheritance that included a substantial ranch property. There's something else, Connor said quietly. I want you to know that I'm not doing this just for the inheritance. I mean, that's the practical reason. But there's more to it than that. Such as? Connor was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. I grew up on that ranch. It's where I learned everything that matters to me about life and work and what it means to build something lasting. When my grandfather dies, which could happen any time now, there will be people who want to sell that land to developers or mining companies. People who see it as nothing more than profit potential. His hands tightened around his coffee cup. I can't let that happen. That land has been in my family for 4 generations, and it represents everything good about a way of life that's disappearing. But I can't save it alone, and I can't save it without meeting my grandfather's conditions. Sarah found herself drawn in by the passion in his voice. Why didn't you just get married for real? Because real marriage requires real love, and real love takes time I don't have. My grandfather is 87 years old and in declining health. I need a solution now, not in 2 years after I've found someone and convinced them to marry me. The honesty of his answer surprised Sarah. Most men would have deflected the question or made up some story about not having found the right person. Connor's straightforward acknowledgement that he was essentially hiring her for a job felt strangely reassuring. What happens to Emma in all this? Sarah asked. How do we explain to a 6-year-old that Mommy is pretending to be married to a stranger? We don't explain it that way, Connor said. To Emma, I'd just be Mommy's friend Connor who lives with you for a while. Kids don't automatically assume that men and women living together are married unless adults make a big deal about it. We'd be careful about displays of affection, and we'd present ourselves as a family unit without making it complicated for her. Sarah tried to imagine Emma's reaction to such a dramatic change in their lives. The little girl was adaptable and trusting, but this would be asking a lot of a child who had lost her father and dealt with more upheaval than any 6-year-old should have to handle. I need time to think about this, Sarah said finally. Connor nodded. Of course. But I also need you to understand the timeline. My grandfather's condition is deteriorating, and his lawyer wants to see evidence of my stable family life within the next few weeks. If you're going to agree to this, we'd need to move quickly. How quickly? We'd need to be married by the end of next week and relocated to Montana within a month. The timeline made Sarah's head spin. Married in a week to a man she had met yesterday. It sounded like the plot of a bad romantic comedy, except there was nothing comedic about her desperation or his proposal. There's one more thing, Connor said. If you agree to this, I need your word that you'll see it through to the end. I can't have you changing your mind halfway through and leaving me without the appearance of a stable marriage. Too much depends on this for me to take that risk. Sarah met his gaze directly. And what guarantee do I have that you won't decide you don't need me anymore once you get what you want? Fair question. Connor reached into his wallet again and pulled out a business card. This is my lawyer in Billings. Before we do anything, we draw up a contract that protects both of us. You'd be guaranteed financial support for the full term of our arrangement, plus a substantial settlement at the end that would give you and Emma genuine security for years to come. The business card felt heavy in Sarah's hand, like a key to a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. Everything about Connor's proposal seemed too good to be true, which made her suspicious even as her desperation urged her to grab this lifeline with both hands. I have to get to work, she said, standing up from the booth. Can I give you an answer tomorrow? Of course. But Sarah, Connor caught her hand gently as she turned to leave. Whatever you decide, don't let pride make the choice. For you, sometimes accepting help isn't admitting failure. Sometimes it's just being smart enough to recognize opportunity when it appears. Sarah's shift at the diner passed in a blur of routine tasks while her mind churned over Connor's proposal. The practical part of her brain was already planning how such an arrangement might work, while the emotional part recoiled from the idea of uprooting Emma's life for what amounted to an elaborate lie. During her lunch break, she called the law firm whose card Connor had given her. A receptionist confirmed that Connor Blake was indeed a client, and that there was an active estate matter involving a ranch property. The confirmation didn't prove his motivations were pure, but it did verify that he hadn't simply made up the entire story. Tom Morrison noticed her distraction during the afternoon rush. You okay, Sarah? You seem like your mind's somewhere else. Just thinking about some decisions I need to make, she replied, refilling the coffee pot for the third time in 10 minutes. Anything I can help with? Sarah looked at Tom's kind face and wondered what he would think of Connor's proposal. Tom was a practical man who had built his business through hard work and careful planning. Would he see Connor's offer as an opportunity or a dangerous gamble? It's complicated, she said finally. But thank you for asking. When her shift ended, Sarah picked up Emma from daycare and endured another uncomfortable conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez about the outstanding balance. The director's patience was clearly running thin, and Sarah knew that Friday's deadline was firm. If she couldn't produce the money by then, Emma would lose her daycare spot, which would make working impossible. On the walk home, Emma chattered about her day, blissfully unaware of the storm clouds gathering around their lives. She had made a drawing of their apartment building and proudly showed it to Sarah, pointing out the window of their unit and the little figures she had drawn to represent them. That's you, and that's me, Emma explained, and that's Daddy watching over us from heaven. The innocent comment hit Sarah like a punch to the chest. David had been gone for 18 months, but Emma still talked about him as if he might return at any moment. How could Sarah even consider uprooting her daughters' life for a stranger, no matter how desperate their situation had become? That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Sarah sat at their tiny kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to make sense of her options. She drew a line down the middle of the page and labeled one side stay and the other go with Connor. Under "Stay," she wrote. "Emma keeps familiar surroundings. I keep independence. No risk of trusting the wrong person." But then she added, "Eviction in 11 days. No money for daycare. No way to pay bills. Potential homelessness." Under "Go with Connor," she wrote, "Financial security, stable home for Emma. Chance to start over." Then she added, "Living a lie. Trusting a stranger, uprooting Emma's life, unknown risks." The exercise didn't make her decision any clearer. Both options carried significant risks, but only one offered a potential solution to their immediate crisis. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Sarah, this is Connor. I forgot to mention that the ranch has horses. I thought Emma might like to know that. No pressure on your decision either way." Sarah stared at the message for a long time. Connor hadn't needed to text her, and he certainly hadn't needed to think about what Emma might enjoy about ranch life. The fact that he had considered her daughter's potential happiness suggested a thoughtfulness that went beyond the practical necessities of their proposed arrangement. She walked to the window and looked out at the apartment building's small courtyard, where broken playground equipment sat unused and a few struggling plants fought for survival in small patches of dirt. Is this really what she wanted to preserve for Emma? This urban decay that offered little hope and less opportunity. Sarah thought about the ranch Connor had described. 3,000 acres of open space where a 6-year-old could run and explore, and discover that the world was bigger and more beautiful than a cramped apartment in a struggling neighborhood. She thought about financial security that would allow her to focus on being a mother instead of constantly worrying about survival. But mostly, she thought about the crushing weight of their current situation and the mathematical certainty that they were running out of time and options. Connor's proposal might be risky, but staying here was guaranteed failure. The eviction notice was still taped to their refrigerator, a constant reminder of the countdown to disaster. 11 days to find a miracle or watch their lives collapse completely. Maybe Connor Blake was that miracle. Or maybe he was just another kind of disaster waiting to happen. But as Sarah looked around their small apartment and thought about Emma's future, she realized that some risks were worth taking when the alternative was certain defeat. Tomorrow, she would give Connor her answer. And despite all her fears and reservations, she was beginning to suspect what that answer would be. The marriage certificate felt surreal in Sarah's hands as she stood in the county clerk's office 3 weeks later, Emma tugging at her simple blue dress while Connor signed the final documents. The ceremony had been perfunctory and businesslike, witnessed by 2 courthouse employees who seemed more interested in their lunch break than the union they were witnessing. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Blake," the clerk said with practiced efficiency, handing them the official certificate. "Your marriage license is now complete." Sarah stared at her new legal name on the document. Sarah Blake. It looked foreign, like a costume she was wearing that didn't quite fit. Beside her, Connor maintained the composed demeanor he had shown throughout their whirlwind courtship for legal purposes, but she caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, perhaps, or maybe anxiety about what they had just committed themselves to. Emma looked up at Connor with the curious interest she had shown since he had become a regular presence in their lives over the past 3 weeks. "Are you my new daddy now?" she asked with the directness that only children possessed. Connor knelt down to Emma's level, his voice gentle but honest. "I'm going to be living with you and your mommy for a while, and I'm going to help take care of you both. But your real daddy will always be your daddy, okay? I'm just going to be your friend Connor who helps out." Emma nodded solemnly, seeming to accept this explanation with the adaptability that had amazed Sarah throughout this entire process. Children, it seemed, were far more resilient than adults when it came to accepting unconventional arrangements. The drive to Montana had taken 2 days, with Connor following behind Sarah's packed car in his pickup truck. They had stayed in separate motel rooms each night, maintaining the careful boundaries they had established from the beginning. Emma had treated the journey like an adventure, excitedly pointing out mountains and prairies she had never seen before. Now, as they pulled up the long gravel driveway to the Blake family ranch, Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The property was more beautiful than Connor's descriptions had prepared her for. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, dotted with cattle and horses grazing peacefully in the late afternoon sun. The main house was a two-story log structure that managed to look both rustic and elegant, with a wraparound porch that invited lazy summer evenings. "It's like a picture book," Emma whispered from the back seat, her face pressed against the window. Connor had been right about one thing. This was a far cry from their cramped apartment and the urban decay they had left behind. Here, Emma would have space to run and explore, fresh air to breathe, and a sense of freedom that their previous life had never offered. "The horses live in that big building over there," Connor said, pointing to a red barn about 100 yards from the house. "Would you like to meet them tomorrow?" Emma's eyes widened with excitement. "Real horses that I can touch?" "Real horses," Connor confirmed. "But we'll need to teach you how to approach them safely first." As they unloaded their belongings, Sarah was struck by how few possessions they had brought with them. Everything they owned fit into 4 suitcases and 3 boxes. It felt symbolic somehow, as if they were shedding their old lives along with their old things. The inside of the house was warm and welcoming, with hardwood floors, exposed beam ceilings, and furniture that looked both comfortable and well-made. Connor showed them to their rooms on the 2nd floor, Emma's bedroom next to Sarah's, with Connor's room at the opposite end of the hall. The arrangement maintained their agreed-upon boundaries, while still appearing familial to any outside observers. Emma's room had been prepared with obvious care. There was a child-sized bed with a colorful quilt, a bookshelf filled with age-appropriate books, and toys that suggested Connor had given considerable thought to what a 6-year-old might enjoy. Sarah was touched by the effort, even as she reminded herself that it was all part of the performance they needed to maintain. That first evening, they ate dinner at the large kitchen table while Connor explained the daily routines of ranch life. There were horses to feed, cattle to check on, and endless maintenance tasks that kept a property this size functioning. He had hired help for the heavy work, but there were still responsibilities that required his daily attention. "What will I do all day?" Sarah asked, suddenly realizing that her role in this arrangement had never been clearly defined beyond simply being present as his wife. "Whatever you want," Connor replied. "There's no requirement that you work on the ranch, though. You're welcome to if you're interested. Some of the previous owners' wives have helped with bookkeeping, others have focused on the household management, and some have pursued their own interests entirely." The freedom felt strange after months of scrambling for survival. The idea that she could choose how to spend her days, that money wasn't a constant source of anxiety, required a mental adjustment she hadn't anticipated. Over the following weeks, they settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Connor left early each morning to tend to ranch business, while Sarah got Emma ready for school in the nearby town. The local elementary school was smaller than Emma's previous school, but seemed well-funded and staffed with teachers who genuinely cared about their students. Sarah found herself taking on household responsibilities not because they were required, but because they gave her a sense of purpose. She cooked meals, maintained the house, and gradually began to feel like she was contributing something meaningful to their arrangement. Connor never asked her to do these things, but he always expressed genuine appreciation when he came home to a prepared dinner or a clean house. The local community accepted them as Connor's new family with the kind of warm curiosity that characterized small-town life. Neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves and welcome Sarah and Emma to the area. Sarah found herself spinning elaborate backstories about how she and Connor had met, how their relationship had developed, and why they had decided to move to Montana together. The lies came easier than she had expected. but they also felt heavier. With each repetition, Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who lived on the adjacent property, brought over a casserole and stayed for coffee, asking detailed questions about their courtship and marriage that required increasingly creative responses. "Connor's always been such a catch," Mrs. Patterson said with a knowing smile. "Half the single women in 3 counties have been trying to get his attention for years. You must be pretty special to have finally tied him down." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she manufactured a story about their whirlwind romance and Connor's romantic proposal. The fictional version of their relationship was becoming more elaborate with each telling, and she worried about keeping all the details straight. Emma adapted to their new life with the resilience Connor had predicted. She loved the horses, delighted in gathering eggs from the chickens, and seemed to thrive in the wide-open spaces of ranch life. Her laughter rang across the property as she chased butterflies or helped Connor with simple chores, and Sarah found herself grateful for the joy their arrangement had brought to her daughter's life. But as the weeks passed, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the dynamic between herself and Connor. The careful politeness of their early interactions was giving way to something more comfortable, more familiar. They had developed inside jokes and shared routines that felt less like performance and more like genuine partnership. Connor had proven to be surprisingly thoughtful in dozens of small ways. He always asked about Emma's day at school and listened with genuine interest to her 6-year-old tales of classroom drama and playground adventures. He fixed the wobbly leg on Sarah's dresser without being asked and always made sure there was fresh coffee waiting when she came downstairs each morning. One evening, as they sat on the front porch watching Emma play with a litter of barn kittens, Connor turned to Sarah with an expression of quiet contentment. "This feels good," he said simply. "Having people in this house again, I mean. It's been empty too long." Sarah felt a flutter of something in her chest that she quickly pushed aside. "Emma loves it here. I haven't seen her this happy since before David died." "What about you?" Connor asked. "Are you happy here?" The question caught Sarah off guard. Happiness hadn't been part of their contractual arrangement, and she wasn't sure how to evaluate her emotional state within the context of their business relationship. "Ungrateful," she said carefully. "This has given us security and stability that we never could have achieved on our own." Connor nodded, but she sensed that her diplomatic answer hadn't been what he was hoping to hear. The moment passed, but it left Sarah with an uncomfortable awareness that the boundaries between performance and reality were becoming increasingly blurred. The first real complication arose when Connor's grandfather's lawyer, Mr. Hutchinson, announced he would be visiting the ranch the following week to conduct his first official assessment of Connor's family situation. The news brought back all of Sarah's anxiety about their deception and the potential consequences if they were discovered. "What exactly will he be looking for?" Sarah asked as they planned for the visit. "Evidence that we're a genuine married couple raising a stable family," Connor replied. "He'll want to see that we share living space appropriately, that we interact naturally as spouses, and that Emma is thriving in our care." "Define interact naturally as spouses," Sarah said, feeling her stomach clench with worry. Connor was quiet for a moment. "We'll need to seem comfortable with physical affection. Nothing inappropriate, but the kind of casual touching that married couples take for granted. Sitting close together, maybe holding hands, that sort of thing." The idea of feigning physical intimacy, even innocent affection, made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. She had barely been touched by another person since David's death, and the thought of pretending romantic connection felt like a betrayal of her late husband's memory. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted quietly. Connor's expression softened with understanding. "We'll practice beforehand, just simple things. And remember, it's only for a few hours while he's here. After that, things can go back to normal." But even as Connor reassured her, Sarah wondered what normal meant anymore. Their arrangement had already shifted so far from its original businesslike parameters that she wasn't sure where the performance ended and their genuine relationship began. The night before Mr. Hutchinson's visit, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the stories they had crafted about their marriage and worrying about every detail that might give them away. Across the hall, she could hear Connor moving around in his room, presumably dealing with his own pre-visit anxiety. Around midnight, she heard a soft knock on her door. When she opened it, Connor stood in the hallway wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt, his hair disheveled from sleep. "I couldn't sleep either," he said quietly. "Want some tea? We could go over our story one more time." They sat at the kitchen table with steaming mugs of chamomile tea, reviewing the timeline of their fictional relationship and practicing the casual interactions they would need to display for Mr. Hutchinson when Connor took her hand to demonstrate how married couples might sit together. Sarah felt an unexpected jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with their performance. "Your hands are shaking," Connor observed gently. "I'm nervous about tomorrow," Sarah admitted. "What if he sees through us? What if we're not convincing enough?" Connor squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We'll be fine. Just remember that the best lies are built on truth. We genuinely care about each other's well-being. We're genuinely committed to making this work, and Emma is genuinely thriving here. Those feelings are real, even if the marriage certificate is just paper." His words were meant to be comforting, but they highlighted the very confusion that had been growing in Sarah's mind. How much of what she felt for Connor was gratitude for his help, and how much was something deeper? When had she stopped thinking of him as a stranger she was helping and started thinking of him as someone she looked forward to seeing each day? The visit from Mr. Hutchinson went better than Sarah had dared to hope. The elderly lawyer seemed impressed by the obvious improvements to Emma's life and the comfortable way Sarah and Connor interacted around the house. They managed to maintain their performance of marital affection without it feeling forced or unnatural, though Sarah was hyper-aware of every touch and glance throughout the day. "You've built a lovely family here," Mr. Hutchinson told Connor as he prepared to leave. "Your grandfather would be pleased to see how well you've embraced your responsibilities." After the lawyer's car disappeared down the driveway, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and unexpected sadness. The visit was over, which meant they could return to their normal boundaries and careful distance. But part of her had enjoyed the excuse to act like they belonged together, to pretend that their partnership was based on love rather than necessity. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching Emma play, Connor turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For today, for all of this. I know it hasn't been easy." "It's been easier than I expected," Sarah replied honestly. "In some ways." "What ways have been harder than expected?" Sarah hesitated, not sure how much truth their arrangement could bear. "Sometimes I forget that this isn't real," she admitted. "Sometimes it feels like we actually are a family, and that makes it complicated." Connor was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Would that be such a terrible thing, if some of it became real?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized that their careful business arrangement had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than either of them had anticipated. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm not sure I'm ready to find out." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah realized that ready or not, they were already finding out. The facade they had built was becoming more real every day, and the careful boundaries they had established were proving to be far more fragile than either of them had realized. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, while Sarah was helping Emma get ready for school, and Connor was already out checking on the cattle. Emma was chattering about her upcoming school play, where she would be playing a sunflower, when Sarah's phone rang with an unknown Montana number. Double quotes Mrs. Blake. This is Dr. Morrison from Billings General Hospital. I'm calling about Harrison Blake. Sarah's stomach dropped. Connor's grandfather had been declining steadily over the past month, but the old man's stubborn refusal to acknowledge his failing health had made it easy to pretend the inevitable wasn't approaching. Is you ... double quote Sarah began, then caught herself. She wasn't really Connor's wife, wasn't really family, and had no legitimate reason to be receiving this call. He's stable for now, but his condition has deteriorated significantly overnight. He's been asking for Connor. Could you please have him call the hospital as soon as possible? After hanging up, Sarah immediately tried Connor's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The north pasture where he was working had spotty cell coverage, and she knew it might be hours before he got the message. She looked at Emma, who was still focused on finding her favorite hair ribbon, and made a quick decision. Change of plans, sweetheart. We're going to take a little drive to find Connor. The ranch was vast, and tracking down Connor required driving to several different locations before Sarah finally spotted his truck near the creek that ran through the eastern section of the property. She could see him in the distance, working to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in the previous week's storm. As she walked across the field toward him, Sarah was struck by how natural he looked in this environment. Over the past 2 months, she had watched him work this land with the kind of unconscious competence that spoke of deep familiarity and genuine love for what he did. Whatever had brought Connor back to this ranch, it was clear that he belonged here in a way that went far beyond legal inheritance. Connor, she called out when she was close enough for him to hear. He looked up from his work, and his expression immediately shifted to concern when he saw her approaching with Emma in tow. What's wrong? The hospital called. It's your grandfather. The color drained from Connor's face, and he dropped the fence post he had been holding. How bad? They said stable but deteriorated. He's been asking for you. Connor was already moving toward his truck before Sarah finished speaking. I have to go to Billings. Can you? Of course. Emma and I will come with you. The drive to Billings took 3 hours, during which Connor barely spoke. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, and she found herself wishing she could offer comfort that went beyond their contractual arrangement. Emma fell asleep in the back seat halfway through the journey, leaving Sarah and Connor alone with the weight of unspoken concerns. Tell me about him, Sarah said quietly. Your grandfather. Connor was silent for so long that Sarah wondered if he had heard her. Then, without taking his eyes off the road, he began to speak. His name is Harrison Blake, and he's the toughest man I've ever known. He built that ranch from almost nothing, working 16-hour days for decades to turn it into what it is now. He taught me everything I know about cattle, about the land, about what it means to be responsible for something bigger than yourself. Connor's voice carried a mixture of love and pain that made Sarah's chest ache. He also has very definite ideas about how life should be lived. Family first, hard work, traditional values. When I left Montana 8 years ago to try my luck in the business world, he took it as a personal betrayal. What happened in the business world, I mean? Connor's laugh was bitter. I thought I was smarter than ranch life. I moved to Seattle, got into real estate development, made a lot of money very quickly. I was going to prove to my grandfather that there were other ways to be successful. Sarah waited for him to continue, sensing there was more to the story. I got involved with the wrong people, made some bad decisions. I trusted a partner who turned out to be running a Ponzi scheme. When everything collapsed, I lost everything. My money, my reputation, my fiancée who decided she didn't want to be associated with a failure. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Connor had been engaged, had loved someone enough to plan a future with them, only to have that person abandon him when his success disappeared. That's when you came back to the ranch? Not immediately. I spent 2 years trying to rebuild, to prove that I could recover from the failure. But my grandfather's health started declining, and I realized that my pride was going to cost me the only thing that had ever really mattered. Connor pulled into the hospital parking lot and turned off the engine, but made no move to get out of the truck. The marriage requirement isn't just about tradition. Sarah, my grandfather wants to make sure I've learned to value stability over ambition, family over financial success. He wants proof that I won't abandon what matters for the promise of something that might not last. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. Connor was proving his commitment to family values through a fake marriage, demonstrating his devotion to stability through an elaborate deception. The contradiction felt heavy and uncomfortable. As they walked into the hospital, Harrison Blake was a smaller man than Sarah had expected, diminished by illness but still radiating the kind of presence that commanded respect. His eyes, the same deep blue as Connor's, tracked their movement as they entered the hospital room, and Sarah felt herself being evaluated with an intensity that made her nervous. "So this is the woman who finally tamed you," Harrison said to Connor, his voice weak but still carrying traces of authority. "Grandfather, this is Sarah, and this is Emma, my ... Connor hesitated for just a moment. "My daughter." The slight pause wasn't lost on Harrison, whose sharp eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Connor's face. But Emma, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, approached the hospital bed with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Are you very sick?" she asked with 6-year-old directness. Harrison's stern expression softened as he looked at Emma. "I'm old, little one. Sometimes that's the same thing as being sick." Over the next hour, Sarah watched Connor interact with his grandfather and saw a side of him she had never witnessed before. The confident, capable man she had come to know seemed younger in Harrison's presence, more vulnerable, as if seeking approval he had been denied for years. "The ranch looks good," Harrison said to Connor. "Mrs. Patterson tells me you've been working hard, making improvements. I love that land, grandfather." "I always have, but you left it." "I made mistakes. I thought I needed to prove something that I didn't need proving." Harrison studied Connor for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Sarah. "And what about you, young lady? What do you think of ranch life?" Sarah felt the weight of Harrison's scrutiny and chose her words carefully. "It's beautiful. Emma loves it there, and I can see why Connor feels so connected to the land. City girl, aren't you? I can tell by the way you hold yourself. Ranch life isn't easy for women who aren't used to it." "I'm stronger than I look," Sarah replied, meeting Harrison's gaze directly. Something in her tone seemed to amuse the old man. "I bet you are. Takes strength to raise a child alone." The comment hung in the air, and Sarah realized that Harrison knew more about her situation than Connor had probably told him. The old man was sharp, despite his illness, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing through their carefully constructed facade. A nurse came in to administer Harrison's medication, and Connor suggested they step outside to give him some rest. In the hospital corridor, Sarah felt the weight of what she had just witnessed. "He knows," she said quietly to Connor. "Knows what?" "That something isn't right about our marriage. He's too perceptive not to have picked up on the inconsistencies." Connor ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sarah had come to recognize as a sign of stress. "Maybe, but knowing and proving are different things, as long as we maintain the appearance." "Connor." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. "What happens if he finds out the truth?" "I lost everything. The ranch, the inheritance, any chance of honoring his legacy the way it should be honored." Sarah felt a stab of guilt that surprised her with its intensity. She had been so focused on what their arrangement meant for her and Emma that she hadn't fully considered what Connor stood to lose if their deception was discovered. They returned to Harrison's room to find him sitting up in bed, looking more alert than he had when they arrived. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble. about family traditions and what they really mean. Connor tensed beside Sarah, and she could feel his anxiety radiating like heat. I've spent a lot of years thinking that marriage and family were about following certain rules, meeting certain expectations, Harrison continued. But watching you three together today, I'm wondering if I've been looking at it all wrong. Sarah's heart began to race. This sounded like the beginning of a confession that could unravel everything they had built. What do you mean, grandfather? Harrison's eyes moved from Connor to Sarah to Emma, who was coloring quietly in a chair by the window. I mean that families come together in all kinds of ways, and love doesn't always follow the rules we think it should. The old man's gaze settled on Sarah with an intensity that made her feel exposed. You love my grandson, don't you? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. In all their preparation for maintaining their facade, this was the one question she hadn't prepared for, perhaps because she hadn't wanted to examine her own feelings too closely. Sarah began, then stopped, realizing that any answer she gave would either be a lie or a revelation she wasn't ready to make. It's all right, Harrison said gently. Sometimes it takes a while to recognize love when it grows slowly instead of hitting you like lightning. Connor stepped forward slightly, as if to shield Sarah from his grandfather's questioning. Grandfather, Sarah and I know exactly what you and Sarah are, Harrison interrupted, and Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. You're two people who found each other when you both needed saving. You're a family that came together out of necessity and discovered something real in the process. Sarah stared at the old man, trying to understand what he was saying. Did he know about their arrangement, or was he simply making observations about their relationship that hit closer to the truth than either of them was comfortable admitting? The question, Harrison continued, is whether you're brave enough to stop pretending and start being honest about what you found together. Connor and Sarah exchanged glances, and Sarah saw her own confusion reflected in his eyes. They had been so focused on maintaining their deception that they hadn't stopped to consider what truth might look like. I'm going to be honest with you, Harrison said, settling back against his pillows. I've known from the beginning that there was something unconventional about your marriage. The timeline was too convenient, the story too neat. But I've also seen how you look at each other, how you move around each other like you're learning to be partners. Sarah felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and something else she couldn't name. The inheritance conditions weren't really about marriage, Connor. They were about responsibility, about proving that you could put something besides your own ambition first. You've done that. The question now is what you're going to do with what you've learned. A nurse appeared in the doorway to announce that visiting hours were ending. As they prepared to leave, Harrison caught Sarah's hand. That little girl needs a father, he said quietly. And my grandson needs to remember what it feels like to be needed by people who matter. Don't let pride or fear keep you from recognizing a good thing when you found it. The drive back to the ranch was silent, except for Emma's chatter about the hospital and the nice old man who had given her a candy bar from his bedside table. Sarah stared out the passenger window, her mind reeling from Harrison's words and the implications of what he had said. Connor's grandfather had essentially given them permission to stop pretending, but Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for what honesty might reveal. Over the past 4 months, her feelings for Connor had evolved from gratitude to something deeper and more complicated. But acknowledging those feelings would mean admitting that their arrangement had become something neither of them had planned. For as they pulled into the ranch driveway, Sarah realized that Harrison Blake had done more than simply see through their deception. He had forced them to confront the possibility that what they had built together was worth more than the lies that had created it. The question now was whether they were brave enough to find out what truth might look like, and whether the foundation they had built could survive the weight of honest emotion. The facade was crumbling, but Sarah wasn't sure if what lay beneath would be strong enough to support the life they had accidentally created together. The phone call that would change. Everything came at dawn on a Friday in November, 3 weeks after their hospital visit with Harrison. Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee when Connor's phone rang, and she could tell from his expression that the news was what they had both been dreading. "He's gone," Connor said quietly after hanging up. Grandfather passed peacefully in his sleep last night. Sarah felt the loss hit her unexpectedly hard. Despite knowing Harrison for such a short time, the old man's wisdom and gentle perceptiveness had made a deep impression on her. More than that, his death meant their arrangement was about to face its ultimate test. Emma appeared in the doorway wearing her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Why does Connor look sad, Mommy?" Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, choosing her words carefully. "Connor's grandfather went to heaven last night, sweetheart. He was very sick, and now he's not hurting anymore." Emma's face crumpled with the kind of pure empathy that only children possessed. She walked over to Connor and wrapped her small arms around his waist. "I'm sorry your grandpa died. He was nice to me." Connor's composure, which had remained steady through the phone call, finally cracked. He picked Emma up and held her close, and Sarah could see tears sliding down his cheeks. In that moment, she realized that whatever had started as performance between Connor and Emma had become completely genuine. He loved her daughter, and Emma had come to love him in return. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small church in town, and it seemed like half the county had come to pay their respects to Harrison Blake. Sarah sat in the front pew with Connor and Emma, acutely aware that everyone in attendance assumed she was the grieving daughter-in-law. The weight of their deception felt heavier in this sacred space, surrounded by people who had genuinely loved and respected Harrison. After the service, as people lingered in the church hall sharing memories and offering condolences, Sarah overheard conversations that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Harrison was so pleased that Connor finally settled down, one elderly woman was saying to another. "He told me just last month how much he loved that little girl. It's wonderful that Connor found someone who understands ranch life," another voice added. "City women usually don't last long out here." Each well-meaning comment felt like another layer of obligation being placed on Sarah's shoulders. These people weren't just accepting her presence. They were celebrating what they believed her marriage to Connor represented. They saw her as the woman who had brought Connor home, who had given Harrison the peace of knowing his legacy would continue. Mr. Hutchinson approached them after most of the crowd had dispersed. "Connor, I'm sorry for your loss. Your grandfather was a remarkable man. Thank you. He was everything to me. I know this is difficult timing, but we need to discuss the estate settlement. Could you and Sarah come to my office tomorrow morning? There are some final details to address." That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah and Connor sat on the front porch despite the cold November air. The silence between them felt heavy, with unspoken questions and the weight of decisions that could no longer be avoided. "Tomorrow we find out if it worked," Connor said finally. "What happens to us afterward?" Sarah asked. "I mean, once the inheritance is settled and you officially own the ranch?" Connor was quiet for a long time, and Sarah could see him struggling with the same questions that had been haunting her since Harrison's death. Their arrangement had always had an end date, but that theoretical future had seemed distant and manageable. Now it was staring them in the face. "I've been thinking about that," Connor said slowly. "About what happens next. And I don't want you to leave." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Sarah's heart race. "Connor ... I know that wasn't part of our original agreement. I know you never signed up for anything permanent. But these past few months, having you and Emma here, it's changed everything for me." Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. "You don't understand the position that puts me in." "What do you mean?" Sarah stood up and walked to the porch railing, needing physical distance to voice what she had been feeling. "You think I stayed here just because of our arrangement? You think I've been pretending this whole time? Connor rose and moved toward her. I don't know what you've been feeling. You've been so careful to maintain boundaries, to keep everything professional, because I was terrified. Sarah turned to face him, no longer able to hold back the emotions she had been suppressing. Because falling in love with you wasn't part of the plan, and I didn't know how to handle it. The confession spilled out before Sarah could stop it, and she immediately wished she could take it back. The vulnerability of admitting her feelings felt terrifying, especially when their entire relationship had been built on careful pretense. Connor stared at her, and for a moment Sarah feared she had misread everything, that his desire for them to stay was purely practical, and she had just made a fool of herself. You love me? He asked quietly. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly. Cold. Forget I said anything. Tomorrow we'll go to the lawyer's office, you'll get your inheritance, and Emma and I will figure out what comes next. Sarah, wait. Connor reached for her hand, stopping her from retreating into the house. You love me? This time his voice carried wonder rather than surprise, and when Sarah looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her heart skip. Yes, she whispered. I love you. I love the way you fix Emma's toys without being asked. I love how you always make sure there's coffee ready in the morning. I love watching you work with the horses and seeing how much this land means to you. I love that you've never once made me feel like I owe you anything, even though I owe you everything. Connor stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the reflection of the porch light in his eyes. I love you too. I've been in love with you for weeks, maybe months, but I was afraid to say anything because I didn't want you to feel pressured or trapped. The kiss that followed was nothing like the careful, performative affection they had displayed for Mr. Hutchinson or the community. It was desperate and honest and full of months of suppressed emotion. When they finally broke apart, Sarah felt like she could barely breathe. What does this mean? She asked. It means we stop pretending and start being honest about what we want. And what do you want? Connor cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. I want you to marry me, for real this time. I want to adopt Emma officially and give her the father she deserves. I want us to build a life together on this ranch, not because of any inheritance conditions, but because we choose each other. The proposal was everything Sarah had secretly hoped for and everything that terrified her. Connor, what if this is just gratitude? What if once the excitement of the inheritance settles, you realize that what you felt was just appreciation for helping you? Look at me, Connor said firmly. This isn't gratitude. This isn't relief or excitement about the ranch. This is love. Sarah, real, honest, complicated love that happened despite our best efforts to keep things simple. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway interrupted them. Connor frowned and walked to the edge of the porch to see who was arriving so late. Were you expecting anyone? Sarah asked. No. Connor's voice carried a note of concern that made Sarah join him at the railing. Two figures were walking up the path toward the house, and as they moved into the light from the porch, Sarah could see that one was a woman in expensive clothes who looked completely out of place on a ranch. The other was a man in a business suit who walked with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. Connor Blake? The man called out. My name is Richard Westfall. I'm an attorney representing Meridian Development Corporation. I believe you know my client, Victoria Sterling. The woman stepped forward, and even in the dim light, Sarah could see that she was beautiful in the polished, expensive way that spoke of professional styling and unlimited resources. More troubling was the way Connor's entire body tensed at the sight of her. Victoria, Connor said, and there was a history in the way he spoke her name that made Sarah's stomach clench. Double quotes, hello, Connor. You look well. Ranch life suits you. Sarah felt like she was watching a scene unfold that she didn't understand but instinctively feared. The woman's presence felt like a threat, though Sarah couldn't articulate why. "What are you doing here?" Connor asked. Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I came to offer you a business proposition, a very lucrative one. I'm not interested in any business deals, not even one that would set you up for life." "Connor, darling, I know you've been playing house out here, but surely you realize that this rustic lifestyle is just a phase. You're too smart and too ambitious to waste your talents on cattle ranching." Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. Playing house, a phase. The casual dismissal of everything they had built together made her feel small and naive. "Victoria, I think you should leave," Connor said firmly. "Just hear me out." Victoria gestured to the lawyer, who opened a briefcase and pulled out a folder of documents. "Meridian wants to purchase this ranch for a resort development. They're prepared to offer $15 million, which is approximately 3 times what the property is worth for agricultural purposes." The number hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. $15 million. More money than she could even conceptualize, enough to solve every financial worry for the rest of their lives. "The ranch isn't for sale," Connor said immediately. "Connor, be reasonable. $15 million would set you free to pursue whatever you want. You could travel, start a business, live anywhere in the world. Why tie yourself down to this place when you could have unlimited possibilities?" Victoria's gaze shifted to Sarah, and her smile became predatory. "I'm sure your little wife would appreciate the financial security such a sale would provide. Wouldn't you, dear?" Sarah felt exposed under Victoria's calculating stare, as if the other woman could see through all the pretenses to the desperate circumstances that had brought her here. "I think Connor should make whatever decision feels right to him." "How?" "Diplomatic," Victoria said with amusement. "But let's be honest, shall we? You married Connor for his money and his ranch. Now I'm offering him enough money to buy 10 ranches. Surely you can see the advantage in that." The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Sarah felt her face burning with shame and anger. Victoria's words weren't entirely wrong, which made them hurt all the more. Sarah had married Connor for financial security, even if that wasn't the whole truth anymore. "You don't know anything about my wife or our marriage," Connor said, stepping protectively in front of Sarah. "Don't I?" Victoria's laugh was sharp and knowing. "Connor, I know you better than anyone. This whole domestic fantasy is just another way of hiding from who you really are. You're not a rancher, you're a businessman. You're not meant for this simple life with a simple woman and her child." Sarah felt each word like a slap. Simple woman. The dismissal was casual and cruel, designed to make her feel exactly as inadequate as she suddenly did. "I think you should leave now," Connor said, his voice dangerous in a way Sarah had never heard before. "The offer stands for 72 hours, Victoria said, unperturbed by Connor's anger. "After that, Meridian will pursue other options for acquiring this land. And those options might not be as generous." The threat was clear, and as Victoria and the lawyer walked back to their car, Sarah felt the foundation of everything she thought she understood about her life with Connor beginning to crack. Connor turned to her, his face pale in the porch light. "Sarah, you have to know everything," she said. "Was she your fiancé?" Sarah interrupted. "The one who left you when your business failed?" Connor's silence was answer enough. "And she's offering you $15 million to sell the ranch and leave with her." "I don't want her money, and I certainly don't want her." "But you want me to choose," Sarah said, understanding finally dawning. "You want me to tell you to turn down $15 million and stay here with me instead. I want you to trust that what we have is worth more than money." Sarah looked at Connor, at this man she loved who was asking her to believe that their accidental love was worth more than financial security beyond imagination. She thought about Emma sleeping upstairs, about the life they had built together, about the choice between guaranteed wealth and uncertain love. "I need time to think," she said quietly. Connor's face fell. Sarah ... double quote. She's right about one thing, Connor. I did marry you for security. And now you're asking me to choose between the security she's offering and the security of trusting that what we feel for each other is real and lasting. Sarah walked toward the house, then stopped at the door. 72 hours, she said. That should be enough time to figure out what we're really worth to each other. As she went inside, leaving Connor alone on the porch with the echoes of Victoria's offer, Sarah realized that their final test wasn't going to be about convincing a lawyer or maintaining a facade. It was going to be about choosing between the safety of money and the risk of love, and she wasn't sure which choice would prove. They were brave enough to trust what they had built together. The morning of the third day dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the pastures in crystalline patterns that caught the early sunlight. Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching Connor work with the horses in the distance, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she wrestled with the decision that would determine all their futures. 72 hours had felt like an eternity and an instant all at once. She had barely slept, her mind cycling endlessly between the security that $15 million represented and the life they had accidentally built together on this ranch. Emma had sensed the tension, asking repeatedly why both Mommy and Connor seemed so sad, and why the pretty lady's visit had made everyone upset. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. A year ago, she would have seen Victoria's offer as an answered prayer, a chance to secure Emma's future beyond her wildest dreams. Now the thought of leaving this place felt like tearing away part of her soul. Connor had given her space over the past 3 days, but she could see the strain in his face, the way he moved through his daily routines with mechanical precision, while his mind was clearly elsewhere. They had spoken only in practical terms about Emma's school, the ranch work, and other surface matters, both afraid to push for a decision that felt too monumental for words. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing her school clothes and a worried expression. "Mommy, are we going to move away again?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" "Because you and Connor look the same way you looked before we left our old apartment, sad and scared." Sarah knelt down and pulled Emma into a hug, marveling at her daughter's perceptiveness. "We're just figuring some things out, baby. But whatever happens, you and I will be together and we'll be okay." "I don't want to leave the horses," Emma said quietly. "And I don't want Connor to be sad anymore." After dropping Emma at school, Sarah drove aimlessly through the countryside, trying to clear her head and find clarity that seemed to slip away every time she thought she had grasped it. She found herself pulling into the cemetery where Harrison Blake had been buried just days earlier. His grave was marked with a simple headstone that read, "Harrison Blake, rancher, father, grandfather. He built something that lasted." Sarah stood before it, thinking about legacy and what it meant to build something that would endure. "I don't know what to do," she said aloud to the silent stone. "I want to choose love, but I'm terrified of choosing wrong for Emma." The wind rustled through the bare trees, and Sarah found herself remembering Harrison's words from the hospital. "Don't let pride or fear keep you from recognizing a good thing when you've found it." Pride, fear. Sarah realized that Victoria's offer had awakened both in devastating ways. Pride told her that she didn't deserve Connor's love, that a simple waitress with nothing to offer couldn't possibly be worth $15 million. Fear whispered that love was temporary, but money was security, and she had a responsibility to choose Emma's financial future over her own emotional needs. But standing in the cemetery, surrounded by the graves of people who had lived and loved and built lives in this community, Sarah began to understand something Harrison had tried to tell them. Legacy wasn't about money. It was about the connections you made, the love you gave, and the foundation you built for the people who came after you. When she returned to the ranch, she found Connor in the barn, grooming one of the horses with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was using physical work to quiet his own mental turmoil. He looked up when she entered, and the hope and fear in his eyes made her chest ache. "I've been thinking," Sarah said without preamble, "about what Victoria said, about what she offered." Connor's hands stilled on the horse's flank. "And? She was right about one thing. I did marry you for security. I was desperate and scared, and you offered me a way to save my daughter from the consequences of my failures." Connor's face fell, and Sarah saw him preparing for rejection. "But she was wrong about everything else," Sarah continued. "She was wrong when she called what we've built here a fantasy. She was wrong when she said you were hiding from who you really are. And she was especially wrong when she implied that love could be bought." Sarah stepped closer, close enough to see the rapid pulse in Connor's neck. "I love you. Not because you saved us, not because you provide security, but because of who you are when you think no one is watching. Because you fix Emma's toys without being asked. Because you know the name of every cow on this ranch. Because you choose this life every day, not because you have to, but because it's who you are." Connor reached for her hands, and Sarah could feel the calluses on his palms, the evidence of honest work and genuine purpose. "What are you saying, Sarah?" "I'm saying that $15 million can't buy what we have. It can't buy the way Emma lights up when she sees you coming home. It can't buy the peace I feel when I wake up in the morning, knowing we're building something real together. And it can't buy the future I want for our daughter, one where she learns that love and commitment matter more than money." Tears were sliding down Connor's cheeks, and Sarah realized she was crying too. "I'm saying no to Victoria's offer," Sarah said firmly. "And I'm saying yes to marrying you again, for real this time, if you'll have me." Connor's answer was a kiss. That felt like a promise, like coming home, like the beginning of everything that mattered. When they finally broke apart, Sarah felt lighter than she had in days. "There's just one thing," Connor said, his forehead resting against hers. "What?" "We should probably tell Emma that I'm going to be her real dad now." Sarah laughed through her tears. "I think she's been hoping for that for months." They found Emma at Mrs. Patterson's house after school, where she had been staying during the afternoon until Sarah could pick her up. When they explained that they were getting married again, this time because they loved each other and wanted to be a real family, Emma's reaction was everything they could have hoped for. "Does this mean I can call you Daddy?" she asked Connor, with shy excitement. "If you want to," Connor replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And we'll stay here with the horses forever?" "Forever," Sarah confirmed. That evening, Victoria Sterling's lawyer called to inform them that Meridian Development would be proceeding with alternative acquisition methods for the ranch. Connor listened to the thinly veiled threats with calm professionalism, then hung up and immediately called his own attorney to discuss protective measures for the property. "They can try," he told Sarah afterward, "but this land has been in my family for 4 generations, and I'm not going to be the one who loses it to developers." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same church where Harrison Blake's funeral had been held, wearing a simple white dress and holding a bouquet of wildflowers that Emma had helped her pick from the ranch's meadows. This time, when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the words carried the weight of truth and the promise of a future they were choosing together. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up on the lawn and neighbors bringing covered dishes in the tradition of rural communities. Mrs. Patterson gave a toast about how love could bloom in the most unexpected circumstances. And Tom Morrison, who had driven up from their old town, marveled at the transformation in both Sarah and Emma. "You look happy," he told Sarah as they watched Emma dance with Connor to music from a local bluegrass band. "I am happy," Sarah replied, and meant it completely. As the sun set over the mountains and their guests began to drift away, Sarah found herself standing on the porch where Victoria had made her offer 6 months earlier. Connor joined her, rapping his arms around her from behind as they watched Emma chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Any regrets?" Connor asked quietly. Sarah leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the certainty of his presence. "About turning down $15 million to marry a cowboy?" "When you put it like that, it does sound a little crazy." Sarah turned in his arms and looked into his eyes, seeing their future reflected there. The crazy part was thinking that anything could be worth more than this. Emma ran up to the porch, her hands cupped carefully around a captured firefly. "Look, I caught one. Can we keep it?" "Fireflies need to be free to shine their brightest," Connor told her gently. "But if you let it go, it might come back to visit." Emma opened her hands and watched the firefly spiral up into the darkening sky, its light blinking like a tiny star against the vast Montana night. "Just like love," Sarah murmured, understanding finally that some things were too precious to be captured, too valuable to be bought, and too beautiful to be anything other. Then freely given. In the distance, cattle lowed softly in the pastures, and the ranch settled into the peaceful rhythms of another day ending. Sarah Blake had found her forever, not in promises of wealth or security, but in the simple truth that some foundations were worth building slowly, with patience and hope and the courage to trust and love over everything else. The stars emerged, one by one above them, and Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, on the land that had brought them home to each other and to themselves. The sound of children's laughter echoed across the pasture as Sarah watched from the kitchen window, her hands resting on her rounded belly. Emma, now 11 and confident in the saddle, was teaching 3-year-old Michael how to hold the reins properly while Connor led their gentle mare in slow circles around the corral. "Higher, Daddy, I want to go faster," Michael called out, his face glowing with excitement. Connor chuckled and picked up the pace slightly, always careful but never afraid to let his children experience the joy of ranch life. Sarah marveled at how naturally fatherhood had come to him, how he had seamlessly stepped into the role of protector and teacher for both Emma and the son they had welcomed 2 years ago. The pregnancy had been a surprise, but a welcome one. After years of carefully planned survival, there was something beautiful about creating life from love rather than necessity. This baby, due in just 3 months, would be born into security and joy rather than desperation. Mrs. Patterson appeared at the back door, carrying a covered dish that smelled like her famous apple cobbler. At 78, their neighbor remained the unofficial welcome committee for the entire county, though nowadays her visits were purely social rather than investigative. "How are you feeling, dear?" she asked, settling into a kitchen chair with the ease of someone who had become family over the years. "Tired but happy," Sarah replied honestly. "This one seems determined to be more active than Michael was. Third babies often are. They're eager to join the party." Mrs. Patterson's eyes crinkled with affection as she watched Connor and the children through the window. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years since you arrived here looking like a scared rabbit." Sarah laughed at the accurate description. She had been terrified back then, desperate and convinced that accepting Connor's proposal was either the best or worst decision of her life. Now she knew with certainty it had been the best. The ranch had thrived under their joint care. Connor's business acumen, developed during his corporate years, had helped them diversify their income streams. They now offered horseback riding lessons, hosted weddings in their renovated barn, and Sarah had started a small catering business that had grown beyond her wildest expectations. The development company had made several more attempts to acquire their land over the years, each offer larger than the last, but they had never wavered in their refusal. Some things, they had learned, were not for sale. Emma burst through the back door, her cheeks flushed from the cold autumn air. "Mom, Dad says we can go camping this weekend if the weather holds. Can we invite the Morrison kids?" Sarah smiled at her daughter's casual use of Dad when referring to Connor. The adoption had been finalized 3 years ago, and Emma had embraced her new identity as Emma Blake with the wholehearted enthusiasm she brought to everything in her life. "We'll see about the Morrisons, but camping sounds wonderful if your father thinks the weather will cooperate." Emma grinned and headed upstairs to change out of her riding clothes, her footsteps thundering across the hardwood floors with the energy of childhood. At 11, she was becoming more independent, but remained close to both her parents. Secure in the love that surrounded her, Connor came in carrying Michael, whose eyelids were drooping despite his earlier excitement. Ranch life had a way of wearing out children in the best possible way, filling their days with fresh air and meaningful activity. "Someone's ready for a nap," Connor said softly, kissing Sarah's cheek before heading upstairs with their drowsy son. Mrs. Patterson watched the domestic scene with satisfaction. "You know, I was skeptical when you first arrived. Not about you, dear, but about whether Connor could really settle down. He had that restless energy of a man who hadn't found his place yet. And now he's exactly where he belongs. You both are." After Mrs. Patterson left, Sarah found herself alone in the quiet house, listening to the familiar sounds of ranch life outside. Connor was back with the horses, Michael was napping, and Emma was upstairs doing homework. The peaceful routine of their life still amazed her sometimes. She walked to the mantelpiece, where family photos chronicled their journey together. Their awkward courthouse wedding photo sat next to images from their real ceremony, Michael's first steps, Emma winning a ribbon at the county fair, and Connor teaching both children to fish in the creek that ran through their property. But it was the newest addition to the collection that always made her smile, a professional family portrait taken just last month, all 4 of them laughing at something Michael had said during the session. They looked like what they were, a family that had chosen each other and been strengthened by the choosing. Connor found her there when he came in from his afternoon chores, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his hands on her belly. "Penny for your thoughts? Just thinking about how far we've come. 5 years ago, I was selling everything I owned just to buy groceries for Emma. And now?" Sarah leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Now I understand what real wealth looks like." The baby kicked against Connor's palm, and they both laughed at the movement. This child would grow up knowing only love and security, surrounded by siblings and parents who had learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased. "Victoria called again last week," Connor said quietly. Sarah wasn't surprised. Connor's ex-fiancée had become something of a running joke between them, calling periodically with new business propositions and increasingly desperate attempts to lure Connor back to the corporate world. What was it this time? A tech startup. Something about disrupting the agricultural industry with artificial intelligence. Connor's tone suggested exactly what he thought of that idea. "I told her the same thing I always tell her. That you're not interested, that I'm already living my dream." As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, their family gathered on the front porch for their evening ritual. Emma read aloud from her current book while Michael played with toy trucks at their feet. Connor worked on repairing a bridle, and Sarah simply absorbed the contentment of the moment. This was what they had built together, not just financial security or property ownership, but a legacy of love and commitment that would outlast any material wealth. Emma would grow up knowing that love was a choice made daily, that family could be created as well as inherited, and that home was wherever people chose to build it together. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Michael pointed at them with wonder. "Daddy, why do stars shine?" Connor set down his work and lifted his son onto his lap. "Because they're sharing their light with everyone who needs to find their way home." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the simple beauty of the answer. 5 years ago, she had been lost in darkness, selling everything she owned just to survive. Now she sat surrounded by the light of her chosen family, Wealthy beyond measure in all the ways that truly mattered. The ranch that had once been Connor's inheritance had become their shared legacy, but more than that, it had become the foundation for a love story that proved some things were worth more than money could ever buy. As they prepared to go inside for the night, Sarah took one last look at the land that stretched out before them, illuminated by starlight and promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but they would face them together on the solid ground they had built with patience, honesty, and the courage to choose love over everything else. She had once sold everything for food. Now she knew that the most nourishing things in life, love, family, home, and hope, could never be sold, only shared, grown, and treasured for the priceless gifts they were. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.